Greetings and welcome to today's MHA Alumni Webinar. My fellowship is almost over. Now what? I'm Heidi Mastrud, Director of Alumni Relations at the School of Public Health. Thank you to all of you who've made time to join us live today. To our attendees who are joining us live, please note that you are currently muted, and at a little bit later in this presentation today, we'll unmute everybody to have time for conversation. But for the time being, if you have a question or need to send a message to us, please use the chat or the Q&A function on the right side of your WebEx screen. Today's webinar is hosted by the MHA Alumni Association and was planned in partnership with the MHA Education and Engagement Committee. We're excited to offer this webinar to encourage and provide lifelong learning to both local and distance alumni, and we plan to offer more webinars in the future as part of an ongoing series. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system and you'd prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel of your GoToWebinar panel, and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can use up your computer's bandwidth and affect network performance. Listening in on a wireless signal may also affect performance. In just a moment, I'll tell you about how to ask a question. So questions are welcome and you can submit them at any time. All participants are currently muted, as I said, so please type in your questions in the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen under Q&A. We'll be monitoring them along the way, so submit your questions at any time. At the end of our time together, we'll probably have quite a bit of time for conversational Q&A. And finally, I wanted to introduce our panelists. They're all MHA grads who have recently transitioned from fellowship to employment successfully. Welcome to Jack, Katie, Joe, and JC. Can we start by having you introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. Thank you for having us, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. I'm Jack Dressen. I'm a graduate of the full-time program in 2014 and helped put this group together, so hopefully we can share some insights for all of you and help you in your next steps in your career as you finish up your fellowship. So as I said, I graduated in 2014. Prior to the program, I completed my undergrad at Creighton University, so I came straight to the program, and then went to Regions Hospital with Health Partners after the fellowship. And so I was working for Megan Remark at Regions Hospital throughout the fellowship. And then as my fellowship wrapped up, I moved into the program manager of telemedicine role at Regions, which was really a project-based role. It was a good fit where I could really kind of hone my project management skills and get to know the organization a little bit further. And then from there, I've transitioned that into my current role. So I've been in this current role for 2 years as the manager of hospital medicine critical care, so managing a group of physicians for Health Partners Medical Group. So hospitalists working at 9 different hospitals, and I've got about 70 providers. So that's kind of me. I'll let the rest of the panelists introduce yourselves, and then I think we're going to banter back and forth just with some of our unsolicited advice, and then from there we'll open it up for questions. So I think next is JC maybe. Yeah.
Hey guys, my name is JC Buswold. I graduated in 2013 from the full-time program. Before the program, I did a little bit of a gap year where I did pharmacological research down at the Health Science Center in San Antonio. Before that, I graduated from Trinity University, also down there in San Antonio. Entered the program. Immediately after the program, I went and completed my fellowship at St. Luke's Episcopal Health System, which is now known as CHI St. Luke's Health, down in Houston, Texas. a little bit of an interesting fellowship, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later, but immediately after my fellowship, I went and consulted for about a year and a half, and eventually found my way to UT Southwestern Medical Center here in Dallas, where I currently serve as the Assistant Director for Pediatric and Adolescent Programs.
Awesome. Welcome, JC. Katie?
Hi there, Katie French. I am currently with Allina Health. Before the program, I graduated in 2015 in the full-time program. I came right from undergrad. I went to Indiana University. After that, I graduated, I went to Regions Hospital after Jack finished up the fellowship there, so also reported to Megan Remark and Beth Hines. It was a great experience, and I've been in my current role ever since. So I switched organizations, went from Health Partners to Allina, and I'm currently a strategy and business development consultant at our system office. So see a lot of unique areas, and it's a really fun role that I've found myself in and enjoying it.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Katie. And then lastly on our panel, we've got Joe Vance.
Hi, everybody. Joe Vance here. Similar to Jack, I graduated in 2014. Prior to graduate school, I was working for the University of Utah Hospitals and Clinics as a clinic supervisor for the Ear, Nose, and Throat Clinic. Did that during my undergraduate studies. Graduated from University of Utah with a degree in information systems, and then worked for a little bit prior to heading out to Minnesota. Came out actually back this direction for the fellowship program with University of Utah Health, and it turned out to be a great thing for me as we've been able to work on a lot of initiatives related to urgent care and in some capacity similar to Jack on the telemedicine side, where ultimately now I've kind of created this job that I'm in, where I'm sitting now as director for on-demand care. And on-demand care encompasses urgent care, our virtual visits product that's direct to consumer. It also encompasses some employer-based relations, as well as working on this collaborative with the AAMC called Project Core. So a lot going on the immediate care services side of things, but that's what's been going on post-fellowship, and it's been a great ride.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you all for being here today. So I think as you hear, a little bit of diversity in the type of work experience we had prior to the program, which maybe informed our decisions post-fellowship. And so maybe if each of you could answer, starting with JC, talking a little bit about as you move towards the second half of your fellowship, how did you, what kind of jobs did you start looking at, and how did you start narrowing it down?
How did I start, what kind of jobs was I looking at, and how did I start narrowing it down? So the process and once again, this is really just my experience at St. Luke's. I would say that it is probably very different, and it varies from organization to organization. We really didn't start looking at jobs until, I'm going to say February of my fellowship. So at that point, we were 8 months into it. So technically, I guess I had about 4 months left. Part of my problem was okay, so if you go on and hop and look at what they have posted online, sometimes requirements don't match up, and sometimes other people know about other positions that might be out there. So I actually started talking to the CEO of the hospital that I was working at, because I wanted to stay on board there, and we kind of talked about some ideas for some different opportunities that she had in mind. Ultimately, they did not work out because she ended up leaving the institution. So that's it's kind of it's a hard truth that people kind of they jump around, and they're not necessarily going to be there at one organization for the entire time. So for me, it was I started by talking with my preceptors. Does that answer that question, Jack? Or
yeah, I think that's great, and I think we'll talk more in a little bit about what do you do when maybe that person that you're leaning on quite a bit throughout your fellowship ends up leaving, and so now it feels like the person who's going to advocate for you most is no longer able to help you find a job in the organization. Yeah. And so maybe let's just focus on that while we're on it.
Yeah, and I guess even to specifically answer the question, typically at St. Luke's, whenever I was there, they had for fellows, it was almost like it was a fast path to, usually for most of them, it was a director level position. I would say that during the year of my fellowship, there was an enormous amount of leadership turnover, and the value of the fellow in the fellowship program overall diminished, I'd have to say. So that really kind of changed the scope of what we could apply for. Unfortunately, the organization that I was with just kind of had a different shifting of how they viewed the fellows. So.
Cool. Katie, how about you? As you were wrapping up your fellowship, what kind of opportunities were you looking at?
So I think it's a combination of things. I knew that I had enjoyed strategy projects more so than the operations projects that I had exposure to in my fellowship year. So I knew I was driving towards kind of more strategic work. And then in combination, I kind of really figured out that as I interviewed for both strategic jobs in nature and operational jobs in nature, getting a better feel for the day-to-day life, I just knew that operations at this point is not the best fit for me. So it was actually going through the interview process for some of those jobs and really understanding what the role looks like. I think the bullet that's most applicable to me here is the second one, what if I change organizations after a fellowship? And quite frankly, it's not something that I expected to do or was anticipating to do or really wanted to do. I had great relationships developed over the year that I was at Regions and Health Partners, so I was actually pretty much exclusively looking to stay there. But at the end of the day, there just wasn't the appropriate role for me available at that time, which is a harsh reality, and it's unfortunate because you have those mentors that you rely on. So how my current role happened was a classmate and friend reached out and shared this open job at Alina, and I was honestly hesitant to apply. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have been because I was a little bit worried about switching roles, but as one of the other presenters indicated, it's really not a big deal. People jump around all the time, and I remember when I told my bosses that, I applied and I got this job, and I was very excited about it. It's not like a grudge they were holding against me by any means. It was actually very accepted, and these people come from all over the place, and there's always movement and fluidity in employers. So that's kind of a lesson that I learned. It's not a huge deal, even though it's not ideal to switch organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in that hopefully your preceptors just want the best for you as you finish up your fellowship, and so obviously they'll hopefully be advocating for you to stay with your current organization and find opportunities for you, but know that probably most of the people that you're working with currently in your fellowship have changed organizations multiple times over the course of their career, and so looking outside your organization for the right opportunity post-fellowship is something that probably is not as uncommon as you might think. Joe, how about you? As you were looking to finish up your fellowship, how did you stumble upon your next role?
Yeah, I guess dissimilar from others on this phone call, I was lucky to have my preceptors stay at least for another year after my fellowship. So a lot of the projects that I was put on, for right or wrong, I typically looked at those projects as, is this a job opportunity for me, or how can I create a job out of this that would be beneficial to the institution? So one of the bigger projects that I got working on towards the latter first half of my fellowship was in urgent care. And so kind of from December, January timeframe, they started getting into discussions at a senior level, looking for somebody that would lead the growth as far as urgent care is concerned for the institution. And so I worked with my preceptor, who was the CEO of the hospital at the time, worked with the executive over ambulatory, and just made sure that I was the smartest man in the room when it came to the business of urgent care here at the University of Utah, and just worked my tail off, got through the interview process there, and it happened to work out that right at the end of the fellowship that I got into the urgent care role. But nothing there was for sure. So at that same time, I was looking into opportunities. Like, for instance, there's the HCA's COO development program. I reached out to colleagues at Sutter to see if there were opportunities out there. I probably similar to everybody else I've looked at the ACHE website. But there's no doubt that it's a lot easier when you know who you're talking to and you have a connection to whatever it is that you're pursuing. But I think one thing to keep in mind, I guess my understanding is that the people listening on this phone call are people that are getting ready to wrap up their fellowships.
That's
and
right.
the one thing I think is important to note is that your job right outside of your fellowship is not going to dictate the rest of your life. So to that question at the bottom that says, what if I don't want to, or what if I don't know what I want to do? It doesn't matter. Get into a role and just start cranking through things and show that you're a valuable person, and you'll find out whether or not you like the operation side or the finance or the strategy, and you'll start connecting with people that are going to get more into the avenue of what you're wanting to pursue. So,
yeah, I think it's a good point. Is in avoiding that paralysis of I'm not sure if I want strategy or ops, or if I want to be in peds or adults or ortho or cardiology. I think as you're coming out of your fellowship, we're all still really young in our careers, and we'll have lots of steps ahead of us, and so it's a matter of sometimes you just take something to figure it out. And so I think that was my experience. So I moved into the telemedicine role post-fellowship, and it was a brand new role in the organization. And so it was somewhat fun for me to be able to create a role and kind of scope it out for what I wanted it to be and work with our leaders on that. But it was also one where there weren't any expectations and I didn't have a lot of clear direction. So I think that can be challenging in and of itself. But knowing that long-term I didn't want to be in IT or in a virtual space, if you will, and so I think it was a nice place for me to have that experience and have some skills, but then also be able to demonstrate to other leaders across the organization your ability to partner and that sort of thing, and then maybe transition that in to a new role, which is what I was able to do. I think when you look at the organization that I'm with, Health Partners, I think it varies a lot by culture. I know JC was talking about director-level positions out of fellowship. At Health Partners, directors are usually 10 or 15 years into their career, and so I think knowing what's appropriate to apply for is really, it'll vary by organization, but knowing that I wasn't going to be considered for director-level positions, I think was maybe a little frustrating when I realized it at first. But now that I've taken the progression that I have, I think that I appreciate the necessity of having to work, more in frontline ops and then be able to work my way up to that level. But I think having patience and knowing that it's not all about title necessarily, but about getting experience. Can you guys talk a little bit about if you would have taken maybe a larger role in the last year or so without the experience that you've had in your current role, is what you might have missed out on? So I'm thinking along the lines of had I jumped into a director role, I would have drowned and not been successful, but knowing that I've had management experience now and dealing with frontline staff and that sort of thing, I think has put me in the right direction to being successful in a director role, whereas straight out of fellowship I wouldn't have been. Can you guys comment on that?
This is Katie. Hey, Jack, related to your sentiments on, I think I would be drowning in a director role right out of a fellowship. But having said that, within the appropriate parameters, I would tell everyone to, go above and beyond what the job description says the requirements are. So my role, for example, required 5 to 7 years of working experience, and in reality, I had 1 year of working experience in the fellowship, and since it was a good fit, they were able to adjust the job description appropriately. So I think, not only keeping within the job descriptions and the requirements, especially for women, go ahead and apply to those REACH jobs. But Jack, I agree with you in which you should probably not be applying for jobs that have, 10 years working experience if you don't have that.
Jack this is JC. I think it's an important point that you made about titles at different organizations. So having worked at 3 different organizations, I would tell you that what one title is at one of those organizations is completely different than what it is at another organization. So where at St. Luke's, they were willing to put a recent fellow grad into a director level position. I would say that the value of that position might translate over to, like at least here at UT Southwestern, that's a manager. That's kind of about the same level of experience that what we would expect here at UT.
This is Joe. I think one other thing to add on top of all of this is you consider all the people that you're working with at that institution that you're working at during your fellowship, and in most cases these are people that have been there for years and years in their management positions, and many of them might be program managers or project managers or operations managers. And so to come out of your fellowship exclusively with the perception that you ought to be director might just pit yourself against a lot of these leaders whose resources you're going to be needing as you continue to develop your job and develop your own acumen. So I think there's that. And then I guess on the flip side of that, I think it's great to drown sometimes, because it just makes you realize how much you have to learn, and you adapt really quickly. So I don't know if I'm going to necessarily say it's a terrible thing to come out with that type of weight on your shoulders, but it certainly adds a lot of expectation. But then again, politically, you've got to be very conscientious of how you advertise yourself and your abilities and who you're working with.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. How about our panelists? Do you have questions of each other?
Whose preceptors left during the fellowship? I think, JC, you said yours took off?
Yeah, so get this. So when I interviewed for my fellowship, when did I interview with them? I think it was October of 2012. So I interviewed with probably 6 or 7 different executives down at St. Luke's. So then fast forward to June of 13. Basically between June 1st, 2013 and December 31st, 2013, 6 of those 7 executives left the organization.
Wow.
So basically everyone that I had been building relationships over the course of my fellowship work's gone. So it's kind of a last-ditch effort. I went up to a community hospital where they had a very stable leadership team, or so I thought. So I was up there from December until June, and then the CEO, once again, that I had basically built this relationship with over the last 6 months, announced she was leaving. I said, okay, it's time. I got to start looking out for myself, because I don't think anyone here is going to start looking out for me, and start looking at some other opportunities. It was kind of a whirlwind fellowship.
Is that the same for you, Katie?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
This is Katie. So I had 2 preceptors, and one of them actually left right after I had moved from Health Partners to Alina. So she went to Fairview. So that was, I guess, reassuring for me, because she was one of the reasons I was really considering staying around and taking a different role. But again, like I said, everyone moves around, even if it's in the same competitor market.
Yeah, I think my lessons or my 2 cents on this would be that putting all your eggs in one basket is tough. It's a tough market out there, and there's a lot of movement that goes on. I mean, I think the folks who are at Alina have seen that over the past year. Certainly there's been quite a bit of change at Health Partners, and I know Fairview's going through a shakeup. So even if you're in the local market, which has historically been seen as somewhat stable, I think there's a lot of movement going on. And so I think the challenge is who are you connecting with in your fellowships, and who are you working with on those projects? And I think something that I found was quite helpful was that while I was able to sit in the executive suite and really on a day-to-day basis work with the VPs and the senior execs at regions in my fellowship, really the work that I was doing on the projects was shoulder to shoulder with directors. And knowing that I wasn't going to get hired as a director post-fellowship, that I really worked to build relationships with directors who are then in turn hiring managers. Because if I'm sitting in a room of 4 VPs, none of them are going to hire me, at least at Health Partners, out of the fellowship to be on their teams. And so knowing that they can advocate for me to the people on their team who are directors, but that the directors are ultimately going to have the final decision on after they interview me whether they're going to hire me or not, even if their boss, who is a VP, may be advocating for me as a candidate. But I think being able to show those directors or people who are in roles that are overseeing the type of roles that you want, rubbing shoulders with them and building relationships with them to show them the type of work that you're capable of is important versus because out of the fellowship, you're likely not going to be jumping into a VP chair. And so knowing who your audience is, I think, is also important.
Hey Jack, that's a great comment because when I interviewed for my urgent care operations job right outside of my fellowship, it was interesting because I had a lot of association with the executive over ambulatory, but my kind of big interview for this role was with all of the managers of all of the different clinics that fell under that executive. And I sat in that panel interview and I thought, oh my gosh, realizing my oversight was that I hadn't had a lot of shoulder rubbing with any of these different management level folks. And I thought, I sure hope this doesn't bite me in the butt as I go through this interview process. And fortunately it worked out, but that was one of the big moments where I thought, oh my gosh, it's not just about the executives in the organization. It's a huge part about them and knowing that's the direction you're wanting to go, but you really need to get out there and understand people at that director and manager level.
Yeah. Because if you are able to hit rewind and have coffee or be able to build relationships with some of those people, and then you walk into the room as a candidate, and they're already, because they already know you, they're already advocating for you amongst their colleagues to say, we want Joe on our team. And then you add that with maybe recommendation from a senior leader. I think that really puts you in a place for a lot of success in the interview process versus some young kid walking into a room and there's no way they want to be managed by you or work alongside you because you only hang out in the executive suite or something like that.
Right.
I know that kind of takes us to the half-hour mark. I wonder if I don't know if we've had any questions come through from those on the line or that are in the Q&A part.
No. We can unmute.
Yeah, maybe we'll unmute it unless panelists have other things to add before we see if we can get peppered by questions.
Yeah, this is JC. I've got probably one thing to add, and I'm hoping this will be music to Jean and Mary Ellen's ears, but every job that I have had post-fellowship was because of the connection that I had made with our alumni network at Minnesota. When I left, whenever I kind of came to my realization that I needed to start looking out for myself, the first place that I had turned was our alumni network, and I was able to actually connect with someone who was a graduate of the program and actually happened to live in Texas. There are not many people from the program who live in Texas, so I was about absolutely floored. She was working for a consulting company, I met her, ultimately it landed me a job with that consulting group, and then ironically, a year and a half, 2 years later, she left for UT Southwestern, and because of that connection that I had initially made, she brought me over with her. So you can't utilize the alumni network enough, especially if you're trying to look for opportunities that are outside of your organization.
I think that's a really good point, JC, as well, in that I think when I've had experience maybe looking at jobs in other organizations or in areas that aren't familiar with an administrative fellowship, and then they see that on your resume as your past experience, and then they say, well, it looks like you just did a year-long internship, and maybe view it as something where we would say that was internship would be pre-residency, and then we have residency, and then we have the fellowship. And so I think for people who aren't familiar with the progression of an MHA, I think it's challenging to get into some of those interviews, whereas if you can talk to an alum who said, I'm just finished up my fellowship, they have somewhat of an expectation of the level of work that you're able to perform at versus someone who might not be familiar with an administrative fellowship.
If I could, it's Mary Ellen. I'm not on the screen, and I'm sitting across the table from Jack, but I just want to thank you, JC. I appreciate it, and I know Jamie really appreciates you as well. And one thing I want to add is that as you are reaching out to the alumni network and connecting, I'll tell you, that is something that we all need to pride ourselves in, and to maintain that network. And you now are going to be a part of that and have to carry on that. It's not a burden, it's a responsibility.
Yeah.
And also, as you are networking, if you ever come across an MHA alumnus who doesn't return your phone call or isn't cooperative, you let me know. Yeah, that's enough said.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I think when maybe one last piece, and this is, if maybe we can talk in salary ranges, but I think for me it was always tough as a fellow to know what to expect from a compensation standpoint. And so without getting too personal, I think it is worth having a quick discussion on maybe what we can expect, knowing that I haven't seen this year's data, but I think fellowships are probably still in that 50 to low 60s range, depending on cost of living in your area. And so, I think as I came through the program, we were always talked about having, a 30% bump from your fellowship.
That'd be nice.
Yeah. and so I think, I think for me it's about a little disclaimer on that. I don't know that that's actually realistic in the way the markets are. Unemployment's low. There's a lot of talent out there looking for jobs, and so I think the challenge is finding a role that has that's a part of a really cool team that you want to show up and work alongside every day. Knowing that the compensation really comes, the MHA is a long-term investment, and that, from an earnings standpoint, where you're at 5 or 10 years down the road is probably what you're looking for, and so I think having patience and saying I'm not going to hold out for a director role so I can be making, $100K or $120K or $150K, and so I think just having those expectations of where the market's at, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe different the markets are different where you guys are.
I would agree.
This is Joe. Oh yeah, I'm just saying the same thing. I agree.
And I would say, this is Katie, I would say something that I had the opportunity was I had a very open group of friends who obviously graduated the MHA program with similar experiences. So if you have that opportunity where you feel comfortable, I know it's a taboo subject, sharing your salary, but from a negotiation perspective, especially if you're in the same market, it was helpful for me to have that close relationship with my friends to better understand, what I should be aiming for.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And tapping into young alumni or people that I think that's part, it is sometimes an awkward conversation to bring up, but I think making sure that you're informed and successful and not going in and asking for 90 when they're going to offer you 65 or 70, and then you look like you are just out of touch with reality. So I think as you move into negotiations, making sure that we want you to be successful in that as well. Okay, so maybe let's open up the phone lines and see if others want to chime in.
Just one moment. I believe.
Okay, so
Somebody's typing.
so we unmuted everyone. So if you are catching up on emails in the background, if you could put your phone on mute, that'd be great, and then just unmute to ask questions would be great.
Are there any questions or comments?
Anybody have anything that we can help with?
I guess I can go since everybody else is not asking.
Please.
This is Mohammed from St. Luke's down south. How's everybody doing?
Hi there.
Hi, Mohammed.
All right, so here's my question. We're, as we go through these job hunting opportunities that are always glamorous and fun to go through, how do we go about looking for the experience that allows for us to get the meaningful experience of hopefully transitioning into a managerial role someday? And for the individuals who did not get managerial positions post-fellowship, have you seen any struggles for potentially making that jump to the next step, and or what are your recommendations for looking at job title versus job experience?
Mohammed, this is Joe. The first thing that popped into my head was, as you're going through are you in your fellowship, I'm assuming, right now?
That's correct.
So as you're going through your fellowship and you start seeing job opportunities come up, you might start pulling up some of those the job postings, and as you start combing through those job postings, trying to identify, do I have this skill yet? And if you don't, then you work with your mentor for your fellowship to say, hey, this is something that I'd really like some experience in, and you can do some diving into your fellowship program to gain that experience as well. Anyway, that was my first thought.
Yeah, I think, so I took a role out of fellowship that didn't have any direct reports, and so it was much more project manager based, and I think it was great to have that experience where I was actually part of a team that wasn't as high functioning as the executive team, and so you didn't get to be privy to all the secrets and all the strategy and all the big budget decisions. And so it was really interesting for me to then work alongside of people who've been in the organization for 20 years and are in an analyst role or are in a administrative assistant role that's not an executive, who haven't moved up the ladder maybe as fast as some of our colleagues. And I think it's really fun to get to know those people. And also, it's a totally different culture so I think what floored me was I'd sit down getting to know somebody and be like, okay, what do you want to do next? Or like, what role are you looking for after this? And they were all very content with where they were at. It worked, their work-life balance was strong. They liked the work that they did. And so I think having an awareness of that not everyone in your organization is looking to go fellow, supervisor, manager, director, VP, CEO, but that probably 99% of your organization likes the work that they're doing and are content with where they're at, and they're not continually looking at job boards. And so I think the challenge with the program is that sometimes we all get addicted to that because of the residency search and the fellowship search and now post-fellowship search, so you kind of get in this job cycle. And so I think being able to realize that the people that you're surrounded with maybe have been in the same role for 17 or 18 years or longer, And so just honoring that and not looking like you're just there to climb, but really looking to see what kind of value can you learn from their being content with where they're at and really building an expertise in that role.
It's Mary Ellen. This is your conversation,
Sure.
but I just want to bounce in another suggestion for people who are early on in either in your fellowship or your first experiences. Lots of times organizations will have a gap, a moment where they need some help on a short-term basis. Say an interim manager of a clinic, for example, in an interim role. That often can give you some leadership or management experience without really too much risk for the organization. So watch for those kinds of opportunities too.
Yeah, I think interim roles are great, and I think bottom line, my point would be that sometimes before you can manage a group of 10 or 15 people, that you have to have the experience of what their lives are like, so that you can manage them effectively versus coming in and sitting down at an annual review and saying, if you have done some internal reflection and said, I want my next role to be in 2 years, and then you sit down and you want to coach your team member up to say, okay, a year has gone by and you haven't moved up at all. How can we help you move up? And their response might be, I don't want to move up. And so then what? How do you coach them through that to make sure that maybe you need more of them, but you need them to take on some new skills, but they don't want to, which is totally different than the classmates that you went with who are continuing looking to learn or grow their role.
And I would add on it, Mohammed, I think one of your questions was going from a non-manager position to potentially a manager position in the future. I would say it's completely fine to not have a manager role or title right after the fellowship, even though, I've heard many of my colleagues go right into managing multiple clinics. I think that's kind of one of the traditional after the fellowship paths for many MHAs. But in my role, I currently don't manage any people. I'm certainly very busy, but going forward, if I wanted to go to that, manager, director level, whatever it is, I would say get in an organization that you love and believe in and just make your boss aware of your goals and you can make it happen.
Other questions from the phone?
Questions for each other, I think, as well for all of you attending. This is a great opportunity to speak to your classmates.
Yeah. Has anyone in their fellowships, is anyone in an interim role right now or have something lined up post-fellowship already? All right.
We're going to start calling on people.
I will say to speak to Mary Ellen's point, this is JC. When I was in my fellowship, I did an interim role for the latter half of my fellowship. Like I said, we had big leadership change kind of in the going into the latter half, so I was constantly told, hey, we'll get this finalized, and I stopped waiting.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, JC, in that the HR process takes forever. That's been my experience. And so knowing that you probably want to get ahead of it sooner rather than later, but also that if people are talking about, oh yeah, this job is coming up, we're trying to get approval for this FTE, I think until you see it on paper, be a little bit cautious, even if it's your preceptor, because putting together a job description and getting the FTE approval is totally different than talking about it would be great to have this type of role. And so I think with organizations, given how challenging funding can be at certain times, that holding out because somebody at one point mentioned a role that you'd be really interested in, even though it's not, hasn't come to fruition, I think I would be weary of that.
Yeah, actually, I've got maybe a question that I might have. This is JC for the panel. How many of y'all's institutions have had hiring freezes in the last year or so?
This is Joe. We actually have not.
Oh, wow.
So it's not like we're out hiring a bunch of different executives or nurses or MAs or even any of that for that matter. But there's nothing at least indicating that we've freezed our hiring.
This is Katie. We had a brief freeze as we had a nursing strike about a year ago or so. But other than that, I haven't had any recently. But it's hard because, as people apply for these different positions, at least internal candidates are always favored. So that's also something to consider if you're thinking about switching organizations. That's often the case. And one other item I guess I'd highlight from my experience, and I don't know if the other panelists have the same experience, but when I was applying for jobs when I was still in the fellowship, applying for jobs is really a full-time job in itself, which seems crazy, but I was fortunate enough to have a lighter workload towards the end of my fellowship, and my preceptors realized that the job application process is a lot of interviewing and kind of sifting through what's out there, setting up different meet and greets, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I actually might have one thing to add to that. This is JC. Just a piece of advice for all the people who are in their fellowships right now. And once again, I can only speak for the institution that I work at, but currently, so let's just say we have an open position and we have 100 people apply. In addition to getting their names and contact information, we'll also be able to see how many other positions they've applied for. And some organizations, we can tell, if we have an applicant who is literally just applying to any and every open position that we have. In some cases, you might be trying to get a foot in the door, and that might make sense. But we've had instances in the past where we've had internal candidates, and we see they've applied for a position on my team, but I can see they've applied for 5 other positions. So, it might cause the hiring manager or the department just to kind of be a little more cautious with proceeding with a certain individual.
That's a really good point, JC. I actually found that out recently about Alina as well through one of my friend's experiences, as he's been applying for multiple jobs. So that's not something that you necessarily think about when you're applying, but a really good point.
We use the same function at Health Partners as well. So I think it's, I had a case where we were hiring on my team, and we had someone who had applied from supervisor to director level roles, and we didn't bring the candidate in for an interview, and maybe they're a really strong candidates and have a lot of strong skills, but I think the challenge is if they don't quite know what their skill set is or aren't able to discern that themselves, the challenge for us is, okay, then you bring them in at a project manager, but they wanted to be a director at one point for some certain role, and do they have an attitude towards that or something like that? So I think when we have strong candidate pools, those red flags will kind of say, well, maybe we'll pass on this opportunity.
I have a question. This is Alex Johnson. I am just curious. It looks like there might be 2 opportunities, and I wanted to just get your opinion. So one of them is maybe a little bit more luxurious, I guess you could say. So it's a director position, but it's within a newly created division, and I'm worried about being pigeonholed in that. Or doing like a practice manager role. It's kind of chasing that title versus starting out as a practice manager. Just kind of looking for opinions.
Are you in your fellowship right now, Alex?
I am.
Okay.
Would you share the, what division the director role is in?
Yeah, it's within addiction medicine. So we're creating a new service line for it.
Cool.
So Alex, if I understand you right, you're saying that you can either choose to go and create this new business as a director, or you can go into practice management?
Yeah, so I've been pretty heavily involved during my fellowship with creating this department, and it's not a guarantee that I'll be able to step into it, but it's a possibility because I've been so heavily involved. So that, or it looks like there'll be a practice manager position as well.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, and Alex, maybe you and I have already spoken a little bit about this before, but so I was in an interim role where I was running one of the clinics out here in Salt Lake City, and at the same time I was working my urgent care gig and working to try to create this on-demand care division within the community physicians group out here at the University of Utah. And I was back and forth because I thought, well, the practice management piece, that's already developed. There's already an infrastructure there. It at least in my realm out here in Utah, it felt like that could have been an easier way to go, and it would have kind of put me right into the flow of people that work in that capacity and then go to be directors of larger facilities and what have you. But from my perspective and what I was interested in kind of more the creation of and strategy of connecting with the system and working with senior leaders in different capacities to try to launch new ideas. And that's what really kind of inspired me to go that direction. But I know from speaking with people out here that they also like the idea of working with that structure that's already been put in place as opposed to kind of the stress that's associated with trying to create something. So I think you just kind of have to figure out what's right for you in terms of what you like to do. I don't think there's if you're just wanting the director role because it comes with the title director, then I probably wouldn't go that route. But in my mind, I see that as you're building a business, you're the one establishing the financials, you're creating what wasn't currently there, and to me that's very appealing. Or you just need to figure out, at least in my opinion, you need to figure out what it is you want to do versus picking over the two titles.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Hi, this is Kelsey Inglesby. I have a question about timing and like when you started applying for outside jobs, and if you stayed to the end of your fellowship, and if you were able to negotiate like a start date, and how that all worked.
Katie?
I honestly cannot remember when I applied to my current role. I think it was maybe 3 to 4 months before my fellowship end date. It was kind of towards the end. I would say earlier would probably be better just to give you peace of mind. But I think that was the timing. And I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question?
When you switch organizations, can you negotiate a start date?
Oh, yes, I would say definitely. And I gave myself, I took a whole month, went to Alaska in between the two jobs, and I would, I viewed it as the last opportunity to have a real vacation before you have PTO.
Okay, great. I'm texting a friend right now, and they wanted me to ask, is it ethical to leave earlier than the end of your fellowship?
That's a good question.
Ooh.
So I think that's interesting. So I left a month into my first fellowship, and then I have a classmate who also left 6 months into, I want to say it was 6 months into a 2-year fellowship. And I know that organization didn't look on that very kindly. My situation with the leadership turnover, I started at Fairview, and so there was some leadership turnover. My preceptor had left, and so I was a little bit floundering, so I hopped out of that fast. I think, I think it's that balance of transparency with your preceptor. If you get a feel like they're really advocating for you to stay and to advocating for you to stay, and they're going to get you a role that is really something that you're interested in, I think that's one thing. But then if it feels like they're a little lukewarm on you, or it doesn't feel like something's going to pan out, my feeling would be that you be somewhat transparent with them, that you are looking outside the organization, and that you don't know how long you're going to stick around, but knowing, but playing it a little bit, probably more politically correct than that, and saying, I'm keeping my options open, I'm looking elsewhere. But I don't know other opinions. I think leaving a few weeks early or a month early is probably okay, but leaving 3 months early and leaving a big project hanging, I think it is about the work that you're doing. If you're just going to leave them high and dry on a project, I think that's really tough. And so I would caution you on that. If you've got something that's going to run through June, and it's a strategic priority, I think you probably need to hang in there through June, but I could be wrong.
I agree with those statements, Jack, and some of your comments prompted me to remind a story of a friend of mine. He's not in Minnesota MHA, but from North Carolina, and your point about being transparent with leadership if you're looking elsewhere, I think is very important, as my buddy was in a fellowship out west, and he ended up getting a job with another local organization, and when he ended up telling his preceptor, and again, I have no idea what their relationship was like, but they actually, quote-unquote, fired him on the spot. So I think just being open and transparent with your preceptor, if you have that open relationship, that's ideal.
Yep, this is JC. I agree. And oftentimes you'd probably find that your preceptor, they might even know about some of the limitations or kind of what jobs are available for you or for fellows. So I know that whenever I was even at St. Luke's, at one point, one of the many preceptors I had recommended to the fellows at that time, look, like you should probably start taking a look outside of the organization because we don't know what's going to be available given all the transition.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. I know we're right up on time, and so I think we'll maybe cut it off there unless someone really has an urgent question. I think the other piece is if you reach out to the program, you can get connected with any of us. I know we're in the alumni database as well, and so I'm happy to help you navigate if you have case or individual scenarios that you want to have help working through. Given that we've all gone through different and various experiences. But again, thank you for listening. I know it's a ton of unsolicited advice, and we might not be right 100% of the time, but at least you have a little bit to reflect on now as you go forward. And so wishing you the best of luck. And as always, if we can be of any help, please reach out to us.
Thank you, especially to our panelists. I encourage all of those who joined us today to pass this recording along to your classmates and others who might find it valuable. We'll have it available on mhalumni.umn.edu. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.